Eruvin, Dafim Yutes through Chafei, and Daf Yutes. The Gemara talks about people who descend to Gehenna, Jewish people. It says Avram Avinu raises them from Gehenna. Everyone, all Jews, even sinners, except for Jews who committed one particular sin, except for Jewish men who were intimate with non-Jewish women. Why? The Mashcha or Lasso. Avram Avinu does not raise these people from Gehenna because somehow the sin of being with a non-Jewish woman, it distorts his bris milah. Below Mavashkerle, Rashi explained, he doesn't recognize him. He doesn't recognize that he's Jewish because Avram recognizes people by their bris milah. This sin causes a distortion in the bris milah. Avram does not recognize them as Jewish and he doesn't raise them from Gehenna. Difficult to know exactly what the Gemara is telling us, but very basically, it seems to be talking about a particular heinousness of the sin of being with a non-Jewish woman, as opposed to all other sins. This sin in particular causes grave problems to the person that he gets stuck in Gehenna. There is a discussion about this, about exactly how to assess the sin of being with a non-Jew. Intermarriage. In modern Jewish culture, we treat intermarriage as one of the most egregious things a person can do. Not actually so clear from a halachic perspective how to assess the severity of such a sin. The Gemara tells us that if a Jewish man is with a non-Jewish woman in public, that's kana and pogenbo. He can be struck down by zealots, like Pinchas struck down Zimri when he was with Cosby. If it's not b'ferhesia, if it's in private, then the Gemara says it's only drabanan. If it's derech snus, if it's not marriage, not intermarriage, but without marriage, then, and it's betzina, it's in private, it's only drabanan, it's not even derais at all. If it is in the context of marriage, Rambam says it's an issue deraisa of lo tischatin bam. The Torah says that lo tischatin only applies to the 7 nations, the Zayin Umos, does not apply to non-Jews in general. There is an opinion that intermarriage is considered farhesia, so it would have kana and pogenbo if it was a public marriage ceremony. But in any event, it's hardly clear how severe the sin actually is. When kana and pogenbo applies, the Gemara says it's considered kares, punishable by excision, spiritual excision as well. If it's not b'farhesia, it may not even be daraisa. So there's an interesting discussion. How do we compare the sin, for example, of being with a non-Jew versus the sin of being with a Jewish woman who's nida? If a person has a choice, a person is not so observant, he'll marry either a Jewish woman and they won't keep the laws of family purity, they won't keep the laws of nida, that's an iser kares. Or he marries a non-Jewish woman, that's intermarriage, it has these various prohibitions, but there's no iser kares, except if it's b'farhesia, kanan pogenbo, and kares. Which is worse? Poskim can actually debate this. Which is considered a worse sin? Being with a non-Jewish woman and not keeping taras mishpacha, or being with a Jewish woman and not keeping taras mishpacha, or being with a non-Jewish woman. There are actually a number of achronim, the Debertziner and Ber Moshe, Lev Avram, or Avram Weinfeld. Other achronim are mashma this way, that it's actually worse to be with a Jew and not to keep the laws of nida, because that's an iser kares, that's a tremendous aver. Yaakov Kamenetsky famously disagreed. Yaakov Kamenetsky says, yes, on paper maybe that makes sense. Someone who a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, someone who knows a little bit of Talmudic logic might think that, but someone who has a deeper understanding, is more in tune with Torah values, knows that intermarriage is a terrible thing, is the worst thing, and that's perhaps the message of our Gemara, that intermarriage is qualitatively different from all other sins. On Daf Chaf, the Gemara talks about if someone carries, if someone throws, the Gemara often uses zorek as an example of carrying. Someone carries from Rosh Hashanah into the area enclosed by Pasei Biros, into the area enclosed by these temporary makeshift partitions around the wells. So you're chayev. That's considered hotzah from a Rosh Hashanah to a Rosh Hashanah. The Pasei Biros, these partitions, render the area around the be'er, around the bar, into a Rosh Hashanah. So if you throw something from outside, from the real Rosh Hashanah into that area, that's hotzah midaraisa, and you are chayev. The Gemara tries to understand what the chiddush is. The Gemara says pshita. The Gemara goes back and forth. The Gemara says that the chiddush is that it's baki barabim. We're talking about a place that is traversed by the rabbim. A multitude of people pass by. We might think that asi rabbim avashli mechitzta, the fact that a rabbim, a large amount of people, pass through these mechitzas, that transforms it from a Rosh Hashanah into a Rosh Hashanah. Kamash Malan, lo asi rabbim avashli mechitzta. This is the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, lo asi rabbim avashli mechitzta. a rabbim, if you have a space that's enclosed by partitions, even pasibiros, certainly real partitions, substantial partitions, the fact that there's a rabbim there does not transform it into rishus rabbim. Mechitzas trump rabbim rather than rabbim trumping mechitzas. Kan hodiacha kochen shel mechitzas. Here we see the Gemara says that the power of mechitzas. This is the opinion of Rabbi Elazar. A couple of dafim later, on daf chafez, the Gemara discusses this question again. Machlokas Tanaim, Chacham and Rabbi Yehuda, Machlokas Amoraim, Rabbi Elazar, who says Lo asi rabbim avatli mechitzta. Rabbi Yochanan says asi rabbim avatli mechitzta. It's the other way around. The rabbim trumps the mechitzas, and it becomes a rishus rabbim rather than the mechitzas trumping the rabbim. So Rabbi Yochanan says Yerushalayim, if not for the fact that there were doors that were actually closed at night, we had earlier in the Masechta, and actually blocked the rabbim, obstructed their passage, Yerushalayim would have been a rishus rabbim, because asi rabbim, the rabbim who traverse it, who go into it, who live in it, are mevatel the mechitzas, and it would be a rishus rabbim deraisa if there aren't actual doors. Rabbi Elazar says lo asi rabbim mevatel mechitzta. So it's machlokas tanaim, Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan in the Mishnah Pasi Biros. The Rabbi Yehuda says if there's a rishus rabbim going through, you have to divert the rishus rabbim, the derech rabbim, the highway, the public way, because then you would say asi rabbim mevatel mechitzta. The Rabbanan say lo asi rabbim mevatel mechitzta. You can leave the road where it is. So the Chum are Mekel, Rabbi Yehuda's machmer. Pashtus, that's the machlokas, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Yochanan paskins like Rabbi Yehuda, asi rabbim mevatel mechitzta. Rabbi Elazar paskins lo asi rabbim mevatel mechitzta. And then down through the Rishonim and Achronim, we have a machlokas. How we go, whether we go asi rabbim avatli mechitzta, and if there's a rabbim that overrides the mechitzas and the area becomes a rishus rabbim, and you need dlasos, you need doors, as we had earlier in the Masechta, or whether like Rabbi Elazar, lo asi rabbim avatli mechitzta. As we noted earlier in the Masechta, this has huge ramifications for modern municipal Eruvin, that enclose streets, that enclose possibly rishus rabbims. If you say asi rabbim avatli mechitzta, like Rabbi Yochanan, like Rabbi Yehuda, then our Eruv is a problem, because you have a bona fide rishus rabbim, and you need losses. If you hold lo asi rabbim avatli mechitzta like Rabbi Elazar, that's the basis of our modern Eruvin. You hold like Rabbi Elazar, lo asi rabbim avatli mechitzta, it's anyway not a rishus rabbim. Midrabanan, there still is a need to have losses, maybe anyway. Midrabanan, it's much easier to get around that, we can be more lenient, but a modern Eruv is much easier to envision if we paskin like Rabbi Elazar and we say lo asi rabbim avatli mechitzta. And that's the famous discussion of the Bir Halacha. Earlier, but the Bir Halacha says it particularly acutely. He says there's machlokes whether we say asi rabbim v'ashel mechitzta, lo asi rabbim. He says the shita of the Rif and the Rush and the Smag and other poskim paskin like Rabbi Yochanan that we say asi rabbim v'ashel mechitzta and you need lasos, otherwise it's rishus rabbim deraisa. The Rambam, he says, the Rambam paskin like Rabbi Elazar, lo asi rabbim v'ashel mechitzta. So the Bir Halacha asks, so our Eruv, he says, is really only legitimate according to the Rambam, according to Rabbi Elazar. They hold lo asi rabbim v'ashel mechitzta. We're not dealing with the rishus rabbim to begin with, because you have mechitzas, you have tours of Pesach, whatever you have, lo asi rabbim v'ashel mechitzta. So therefore, the Eruv is fine. L'chatchila, you need lasos. That already, there's room for leniency. We can find kulos. Maybe we don't have rishus rabbim because of Shitas Rashi, that you need shishim ribo, so you don't need lasos. Once you start with lo asi rabbim avatli mechitzta, it becomes much easier to find leniencies. But according to the other Rishonim, who paskin like Rabbi Yochanan, asi rabbim avatli mechitzta, and once you have a rabbim, you don't get to square one, you have a rishus rabbim deraisa, and you need lasos, how can our Eruv possibly work? Bir Halacha is very disturbed by this. He says, you have to say, we're somech on the Rambam, we're paskening like Rabbi Elazar of our Gemara, like the Rambam, like the Chachamim, lo asi rabbim avatli mechitzta, and that's what our Eruv is based on. Says the Bir Halacha, that's not really such a great basis to be lenient, because he says it's not a derech kvusha, because rov poskim go like Rabbi Yochanan, that we say it is rishus rabbim deraisa without lasos, and to go like Rashi that we don't have rishus rabbim because we don't have shishim ribo. Rashi also is a subject of contention. So Bir Halacha concludes, as we've noted previously, that our Eruv does not rest on an entirely solid basis. Therefore, he concludes you can't object to someone who wants to rely on the Eruv. However, Bal Nefesh Yachmer La'atzmo, not to rely on the Eruv. So the Bir Halacha's understanding of our Eruv is that we're somech on the Rambam. We paskin like the Rambam, who paskins like Rabbi Elazar. A similar idea is expressed by other Achronim. Ramoshe Mordechai Epstein in Levush Mordechai, he says, he doesn't say we paskin like the Rambam, but he says it's a suffix. We have a suffix like the Rambam, like Rabbi Elazar, lo asi rabbim v'ashel mechitzta. Suffix. We do see asi rabbim v'ashel mechitzta. Then we have another suffix. Suffix like Rashi, there's no Rishus Rabbim at all because you don't have Shishim Ribo. Suffix like other Rishonim, there's no such condition. Mela, we have a Svek Sveka. On a Deraisa level, we have a Svek Sveka. Maybe like the Rambam and Rabbi Elazar and the Chachamim, that once you have an Eruv, we say Lo Asi Rabbim Mavashlim Mechitzta. Doesn't matter if it would have been a Rishus Rabbim, the Mechitzas override that status, so everything's okay anyway. But Rabbanan, you have to have Dlasis. We'll take care of that. We'll be lenient about the Dlasis. But with Deraisa, we have one suffix, maybe like Rabbi Elazar and the Chachamim and the Rambam. Imtim Salomar, we don't go like that. We say Asi Rabbim Mavashlim Mechitzta, like Rabbi Yochanan, like Rabbi Yehuda. Then we have Rashi, second suffix. That Rashi says we don't have Rishus Rabbim anyway because you need Shishim Ribo. We don't have Shishim Ribo to be a Rishus Rabbim. So you have two Sveikas to rely on. Ultimately, both the Bir Lacha and these other Achronim are making similar points that our Eruv is based on a Tziruf, a combination of factors. Maybe we don't have Rishus Rabbim because maybe Rashi's right and the Gaonim that you need Shishim Ribo to be Rishus Rabbim. B, maybe the Rambam is right. Maybe Rabbi Elazar is right that we say Lo Asi Rabbim Mavachli Mechitzta. Daf Chaf Aleph, the Gemara talks about Drabanans versus Deraisas. It talks about the importance of following Drabanans. It says, Hizar b'divrei sofrim yosem b'divrei Torah. A person needs to be more meticulous about following Dinim Drabanan, rabbinic laws, even more so than Dinei Torah. So he says, Divrei sofrim kala overel, divrei sofrim chayav misa. Someone who violates, who transgresses a rabbinic ordinance is chayav misa, liable for the death penalty. Not, Basin doesn't do it, but it's a terrible avera, you're chayav misa. In support of this, the Gemara brings a brisa. Rabbi Kiva was imprisoned in jail. Rabbi Shua Hagarsi, student of his, would attend to him. He used to bring him water. One day, the guards were suspicious of the water he was bringing in. They said maybe using the water to tunnel and escape from the prison. So they weren't going to take away his water totally. They took away half his water. This is all you need. Rabbi Kiva said, I need more water after washing Netilas Yadayim. The reason he needed so much water, he needed some for Netilas Yadayim to eat bread and some for drinking. So he told him what happened, that the guard took away the water. So Rabbi Kiva said, okay, what can I do? I have to wash Netilas Yadayim. He said, Ma'asa, I have no choice. If I don't do Netilas Yadayim, it's divrei sofrim, it's a rabbinic law. I'm chayav misa. So better I should I should die of thirst and not willfully transgress what the Chachamim say and cause misa for myself by knowingly violating this Drabanan. So we split the water in half, and he said he wouldn't eat anything. The language of the Gemara is he wouldn't eat anything until he used water for Netilas Yadayim. So what Rabbi Kiva did hardly seems to be Meikar Adin. First of all, Tosfos points out, we had a few dafim ago, in the end of the first parak, it says that in a machna, a military camp, there are 4 things that they exempted them from. One of them is Netilas Yadayim. And we noted then, poskim say that it's not exclusive to soldiers in a military camp. It applies to anyone who finds himself in a situation of danger. Certainly, Rabbi Kiva was talking about dying of thirst, and that certainly sounds like a dangerous situation. Certainly, he would have been patur from Netilas Yadayim. Machmer alat mohaya. Rabbi Kiva wanted to be extra pious. He was more stringent than the law actually required. Another point is, the halacha is, we pass in Shulchan Aruch based on the Gemara, a person is not even mechuyev to travel more than a certain distance to get water. If it's on his way anyway, then he has to go up to 4 mil, the distance of 4 mil to get water for Netilas Yadayim. If it's out of his way, in the reverse direction, he only has to go 1 mil. Rabbi Kiva couldn't go anywhere, he was in jail. So again, he certainly wouldn't be mechuyev to die of thirst, to risk death by not having water. So again, Kipshuta Rabbi Kiva was machmer al atzmo. Rambam sort of codifies the story of Rabbi Kiva. Doesn't bring it down in quite so dramatic a form. Rambam says it's very important to be meticulous about Netilas Yadayim. The rabbis exhorted us to keep it many times. Even someone who doesn't really have enough water, only has enough water to drink, even such a person shouldn't just say, I'm patur, I can't. He should say, I'll drink half the water I have, and the other half, some of the water I'll drink, and some of the water I'll use for Netilas Yadayim. The Achronim explain that was how we interpreted the story. Even someone who doesn't really have enough water to comfortably wash Netilas Yadayim should stint himself and take a little less water than he would use for drinking and use some for Netilas Yadayim. That's what the Rambam saw in the story of Rabbi Akiva. The Beis Yosef, the Kesef Mishnah, makes an interesting point. He says Rambam brings, based on a Gemara elsewhere, that a person who has no water can wrap his hand. A person, instead of Netilas Yadayim, why do you have to do Netilas Yadayim? So your hands, if they're tamei, shouldn't touch the food. Even though we don't do tumah and tara today, this halacha remains, but it was originally instituted because of tumah. So a person who, instead of Netilas Yadayim, there's an option, lot yadav, a person can wrap his hands in a handkerchief and then eat. Rambam paskins that way. So what was Rabbi Akiva's problem? Let him just take a handkerchief and wrap his hands. Why was he so worried about Netilas Yadayim? Says the Kesef Mishnah. Apparently Rambam understood that the idea of being lot yadav, of wrapping your hands, is only if there's no other solution. You simply do not have water at all. But a person who has water, even if he has a limited amount of water and will have to deprive himself of as much water as he would like to drink, there's no heter of wrapping your hands. Wrapping your hands is only b'diavad if there's really b'shas v'tchak, there's no other solution. That's how we paskin in Shulchan Aruch, that there is an eitz of wrapping your hands, but we don't do that if there's any other solution. Poskim say, anyway, we don't do that if there's any other solution, because other poskim disagree with the Rambam. They learn the Gemara differently and say that lot yadav, we don't paskin that lot yadav is a heter, but even if the Rambam that it is a heter, Rambam says there is a heter to wrap your hands and not wash Netilas Yadayim. Apparently that's only if there's no solution, because here he says, based on Rabbi Akiva, a person should take half his drinking water and wash rather than wrapping his hands. Poskim discuss the question of sakana. Rambam left out any element of sakana. Again, if it was a real sakana, it's hard to imagine that Rabbi Akiva would have done it, to risk his life, to be machmer for such a thing. Some poskim say it wasn't really a clear sakana, even though he talked about dying of thirst. It was a remote possibility. Rabbi Akiva himself was only a chumrah, as we said. He was only acting l'chumrah, and it wasn't such a clear, realistic possibility. So Rambam left out the whole element of sakana. He didn't feel that was the key part of the story. The ikar part of the story, lahalacha, the Rambam understood is that a person should try very hard to wash Netilas Yadayim, should not rely on the solution of wrapping your hands, even if it means that he'll have to do without and deprive himself of some of his drinking water. Again, assuming it's not actually dangerous, then the Rambam paskins you should do so rather than skip Netilas Yadayim or rely on the b'diavad type of solution of wrapping your hands. On Daf Chaf Beis, the Gemara continues from the end of Daf Chaf Aleph. We're darshaning different psukim in Shir Hashirim about the righteousness of Israel and the commitment to Torah and God and mitzvahs. The Gemara darshans the pasuk Shcharos Ka'orev, black as ravens, brings different drushes. Rava says that the simile to a raven is Mishamesim Atzmo Achzari Al Banav Al Bnei Beso Ka'orev, one who acts cruelly toward his family, toward his children. And that's a good thing. Why is that a good thing? Why is it good to be cruel to your family? Brings a story. Rav Ada bar Masna, he was going to yeshiva, to Beirav. His wife said, what's going to happen to the children? We don't have any money. We don't have any food. What should I do for them? You're the provider. I don't have anything to give them. He told her, what's the problem? Mishlimu kormi ba'agma. Have you run out of kormi in the swamp, in the fields? Vegetables, Rashi says, or some type of reed. He told her, go forage, go scrounge for food. I have to go to yeshiva and learn Torah. You'll find something for the kids. A rather disturbing Gemara. Is that really the right thing to do? A person's supposed to abandon his obligations to maintain his family, his wife and children, and tell his wife, just go out and forage in the wilderness for food? Poskim actually discuss this. Poskim discuss whether someone who is committed to learning Torah and wants to learn Torah instead of work, and he doesn't have enough money to support his family, is that allowed? They bring, Moshe Klein, Bnei Brak, brings a tshuva of the Mishnah Halachos. He says, yeah, Moshe Klein is someone who often has somewhat radical or extreme views on these types of things. He says, yeah, you see from the Gemara, that's the right thing. A person who is committed to learn Torah is supposed to be Achzari al Banav B'nei Beso, is supposed to be cruel to his children. Learning Torah comes first. We see other Gemaras to that effect, and that's what he says. However, other poskim are less willing to accept such a thing. In the Piskei Halachos Yad David, he says, even if the wife allows you to do that, he says, and she says, it's okay, I'll work it out, I'll make do, she says, you will tighten our belts, you're not allowed to do that. He brings other Gemaras that indicate it's not the right thing to do. Even though our Gemara says that if you really want to be a Talmid Chacham, you have to do that, he says, you have to say, you can't take this Gemara at face value, he says, you have to say that's only an exceptional person who is nafsho chashka b'Torah ma'od, he just is enthralled by the Torah, he can't do anything else. then he's like someone from an earlier generation, Taraso Omnaso, he's completely monomaniacally committed to Torah, and he can't learn at home, he just no other way for him to do it. Even that, he says, is not a halacha we should paskin, halacha vein morin kain, we shouldn't go around ruling this way for the masses. The Gemara says in Brachas, people who did like Rosh ben Yochai, people who tried not working and just learning Torah, it didn't work out well for them, he says. So this is he very much limits and downplays the practical application of this psak. Rabbi Klein himself points out, legally, halachically, it's a very hard position to understand. A person has an obligation to his family. A person has legal obligations. Because you want to learn Torah, you're allowed to default on your obligations. Can a person borrow money from a bank, from his friend, and then default on payment because he wants to learn Torah? He says, since when are you allowed to do that? Maybe if she married him initially, knowing that was the lifestyle that she was signing up for, that was what they planned to do, she commits herself to that. Still not clear why the kids are committed to that, but she at least will be committed to that. But in general, I think poskim would not be too quick to actually recommend such a course of action. The Gemara discusses an interesting question: why entire countries, entire continents aren't considered, back to Eruvin, aren't considered Rishus Yachid. Eretz Yisrael, the Gemara talks about. The Gemara says it's surrounded by mountains and ditches, and oceans. Maybe Eretz Yisrael shouldn't be. Eretz Yisrael is surrounded by mountains and ditches, and Bavel is surrounded by the river of Pras and Diglas, the rivers of Pras and Diglas. So maybe they should be Rishus Yachid. They should not be Rishus Rabbim. The Gemara rejects that. Obviously, we know throughout the Masechta there were at least parts of Eretz Yisrael, Yerushalayim, that were considered Rishus Rabbim. There were parts of Bavel that were considered Rishus Rabbim. Obviously, the natural barriers, walls and oceans, rivers, ditches around the countries do not render these countries completely Rishus Yachid. The question is, why not? The Rishonim ask, why not? The Gemara just says, obviously that's not true. The Gemara doesn't explain why not. What is wrong with that argument, that they should be Rishus Yachid because of their natural boundaries? Again, we mentioned earlier the machlokas of Asi Rabbim Mavachli Mechitzta, Lo Asi Rabbim Mavachli Mechitzta. If you say Asi Rabbim Mavachli Mechitzta, then fine, then you have a Rabbim. But if you say Lo Asi Rabbim Mavachli Mechitzta, and that's why inside walls, the walls make it Rishus Yachid, the whole Eretz Yisrael, the whole Bavel has walls, so why aren't they all Rishus Yachid? Tosha says, a mechitza that is natural, not man-made, not made by Bidei Adam. Certainly it's a good mechitza. Throughout the Masechta, we know that a natural mechitza is fine. However, a natural mechitza, Tosfos' mechadesh, is inferior to a man-made mechitza. And even if you would say lo asi rabbim mavachli mechitza to a man-made mechitza, when it comes to a natural mechitza, we say asi rabbim mavachli mechitza. That's the sheet of Tosfos. Everyone agrees, even the Chachamim, even Rabbi Elazar, everyone agrees that we say asi rabbim mavachli mechitza to an artificial mechitza. We discussed this in a previous share. Magen Avraham brings this Tosfos lahalacha, even though the Gemara said earlier in the Masechta that rivers in general are valid mechitzas. Our Gemara says they're not, but even though in general, earlier the Gemara did say if you have a mavoi, an alley that ends in a river, the river is a mechitza. So even though a river should be a mechitza, Magen Avraham says not if you have asi rabbim mavachli mechitza. If there are boats, if there's traffic across the river, we say asi rabbim mavachli mechitza. Even if we paskin lo asi rabbim mavachli mechitza like the Rabbanan, that's by a man-made mechitza. But by a natural mechitza like a river, we go with this Tosfos, asi rabbim mavachli mechitza, a tremendous chumrah that you cannot use natural barriers as mechitzas if they're traversed by a rabbim. Then we say asi rabbim mavachli mechitza. A great chumrah whenever you want to use rivers or natural phenomena as natural features of the land as mechitzas, which you can do. Magen Avraham has this tremendous chumrah that we say asi rabbim mavachli mechitza. Magen Avraham himself has some problems with this, contradictions in the poskim. So he proposes maybe you only say asi rabbim mavachli mechitza if you actually have shishim ribo traversing the mechitza, an incredibly rare condition that you have hundreds of thousands of people who traverse the mechitza. Otherwise, we say lo asi rabbim mavachli mechitza even on a natural mechitza. Many poskim debate this. Many poskim say that to the extent that you would say asi rabbim mavachli mechitza would not require shishim ribo, a much smaller amount would suffice to be asi rabbim mavachli mechitza. Even if you say like Rashi that the definition of rishus rabbim need shishim ribo to be a rishus rabbim, but to say asi rabbim mavachli mechitza, you don't require that level of rabbim. Poskim debate this. Mishnah Berurah says he doesn't bring the Magen Avraham because the Magen Avraham is not lahalacha. Poskim generally reject it. We don't go like this Tosfos, or we explain Tosfos differently, but we don't go with this chumrah. and the Magen Avram's chiluk that within Tosfos we can distinguish between Shishim Ribo and not, poskim reject that too. He says that the poskim reject that as well, that if you would need a rabbim, the rabbim wouldn't be Shishim Ribo. Other poskim discuss whether the idea of Asi Rabbim Mavatal Mechitzta, does that mean that Shishim Ribo inside the Mechitza is enough to Mavatal Mechitza, or Rabbim, whatever the definition of Rabbim is, or does it have to be a Rabbim that actually traverse the Mechitza? There are some poskim who argue that even if you have a Rabbim inside the Mechitza, but if they're not traversing, crossing back and forth over the Mechitza, that would not be Asi Rabbim Mavatal Mechitzta. Chazon Ish mentions such a svara. Others say such svaras that to be Asi Rabbim Mavatal Mechitzta, there have to actually be Rabbim who cross back and forth over the Mechitza. Other Rishonim have another explanation. Again, the Gemara says that the natural borders of countries don't count as Mechitzas, Bavel and Eretz Yisrael. The question is why not? The first approach is Tosfos, that when it comes to natural Mechitzas, we say Asi Rabbim Mavatli Mechitzta L'Kuli Alma. The second approach is the approach of many of the Sephardic Rishonim, Ramban and Ritva and Rashba. They say Mechitzas that are too far apart just don't count as mechitzas. If they're very far apart, that's not an allowable mechitza. How far apart does it have to be? So some Rishonim are not sure. The Rashba says it's a nice svara, but he doesn't know what's the share. We don't have a share. Ramban gives a share. The Ramban says a person has to see the mechitzas. The person has to be aware of the mechitzas. If the mechitzas are so far that they're out of his sphere of vision, he doesn't realize them, he doesn't experience them, he doesn't see them, those mechitzas are too far away, and we say that they're not valid mechitzas. Again, potentially a tremendous chumrah. Most of us, a big Eruv around the city can be miles away where the mechitzas are. So is that a problem according to the Ramban and his other colleagues who say this? So first of all, some Rishonim say again that the Ramban is also combined with Tosfos. The Ramban only meant natural mechitzas like rivers and mountains don't count if they're too far away. But artificial mechitzas, purpose-made mechitzas, there's no such restriction. So that's a machlokus, whether the Rishonim and Achronim, whether the Ramban's chumrah applies even to artificial mechitzas. Even if it does, even where the chumrah does apply, however, poskim debate what exactly is this restriction of seeing yourself, seeing the mechitzas, knowing about the mechitzas. So some poskim say that the chumrah of the Ramban is only when the space is wide open, like the countryside in Eretz Yisrael. Between you and the river is no man's land, it's wilderness, it's forest. That's what we mean when we say a person doesn't see himself as in the mechitzas. When you're in a city and it's all built up, even if you can't see the wall, so some poskim say you can't see the wall because there are intervening structures, but you can climb up on the roof and then you could see the wall. If it's a relatively small city, or you have particularly good eyesight, or there's no smog and air pollution, you can see it. Other poskim say even if you can't see it, they say the fact that it's all developed, and you can just go there on the roads and get there. You can get there on the same Shabbos. You can other people live there. You can communicate with them. It doesn't have to be actually physically visible. It's enough that you're somehow connected to the walls. That's enough to be called Roa Atma Tocha Mechitzas, and the Ramban is only talking about where there's empty, open, undeveloped space in between, where you're not really connected to those mechitzas. That's what the Ramban and the other Rishonim are talking about. On Daf Chav Gimel, the Mishnah begins discussing Karpev. Karpev is an area which is not used for habitation. They used to use even exterior spaces for habitation, like a chutzner, but a Karpev is more like a garden or a storage area. It's not really used for dira, for habitation. So there are rabbinic restrictions, it's all midrabanan, but there are rabbinic restrictions about carrying there. The Mishnah brings a whole bunch of different opinions about how large the area is before the restrictions of Karpev are triggered, whether you need residential structures, like at least a guardhouse or something in it, whether the proportions, squares and rectangles. There are numerous different opinions. The Gemara has some complicated discussion. The halacha basically follows the shita of Rabbi Akiva, that if the space of the Karpev, the space enclosed by the walls of the Karpev, is beis asayim or less, if it's only 5,000 square amas, which is 70 plus amas by 70 plus amas square, if it's within that area, it's entirely mutter, no further conditions are necessary, that no rules of Karpev apply. Once you hit that area or exceed it, then we require that it be mukaf ladira. We require that the walls have to have been built for the purpose of dira. There has to be a function of dira. The walls have to be built for that purpose. And that's where the halachos of Karpev apply. We also pass that when it's exactly beis asayim, It has to be square or rectangle where the length does not exceed the width by more than 2 to 1. Arko can only be pishnayim karachbo. If it exceeds that, if it's too long and narrow a rectangle, if the length exceeds the width by twice as much plus one amma, then it's a problem. Shabur says, however, that's only when it's exactly Beis Asayim. When it's less than Beis Asayim, there's no such rule. So the practical halacha is fairly simple. When it is less than Beis Asayim, no restrictions apply. Any mechitza allows you to carry inside the area. When it is 5,000 square amos or more than 5,000 square amos certainly, then it must be hukaf ladira. The rectangular dimensions are really only relevant in the limited case where it's exactly Beis Asayim. But in general, that's the simple rule. Less than Beis Asayim is fine. More than Beis Asayim, we pass like Rabbi Akiva, that we require that it is hukaf ladira. This is, again, a major headache for modern Eruvin, as we'll discuss in the next blot or two, various cases where karpef or karpef-like situations arise inside a larger Eruv, and that can cause serious problems if those areas are not inhabited areas. Post can discuss all kinds of cases. Are they considered inhabited or not? A shul, if you have a very large shul, that's Beis Asayim. Cemeteries, parks, we'll discuss some of these cases as we go. But anytime you have a large space of more than Beis Asayim, more than 5,000 square amos, that is not for residential use, either it's not used that way or its physical characteristics make it unusable for that, that's considered a karpef, and that midrabanan can cause a problem for your Eruv. So the Gemara in the end of the Gemara in the end of Daf Chav Gimel, continuing on to Chav Daled, the Gemara talks about Zeroim. If you have a properly enclosed area, it's not a karpef, a regular hukaf ladira, a regular normal enclosed area, like the Eruvin in our cities, for example. And then the Gemara says there were nizra rubo. It became planted with vegetation. So if most of it is planted, that's kegina, that becomes like a karpef, a garden, and that invalidates the Eruv midrabanan, you can no longer carry there. Not arubo, if you plant trees there, then it's okay. What's the difference between vegetation and trees? Rashi says, bizaronim, in vegetation, people don't live there. That's not dira. Then it's a karpef and it's aser. Trees are consistent with dira. Trees go nicely with dira because it's the way of people to relax and to enjoy the shade of the trees. So trees are consistent with dira, vegetation is not. This is a case where it's nizra rubo, where most of the Eruv is planted with vegetation. Perhaps not the most common case. What is common, though, is the next case of the Gemara. The Gemara goes through various permutations, continuing on to Daf Chav Daled. The Gemara says even a miyut, if the miyut is Beis Asayim or Yosim Beis Asayim, depending on Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanan, certainly if it's Yosim Beis Asayim, the maskana of the Gemara is that Yosim Beis Asayim aser, you can have a large Eruv, it can include tens and tens of thousands of square amos. If you have an area of Beis Asayim or more that is Nizra, that is aser. That area is a karpef, and that will invalidate the Eruv. Poskim over the last several hundred years have discussed the laws of karpef extensively. It's very common. A larger Eruv around a city will very often contain a karpef. So the question is, what do you do? So how do we apply these halachos of things growing there? One question they discuss are, what if it's not pumpkins and vegetables? What if it is flowers and grasses? Is that called vegetation? Meiri already raised this question. Meiri already said anything, again, which is compatible, which is suitable for strolling and for residential usage is not a karpef, he says, and that's the people will make all this, he says. Meiri says, many people are lenient, they have large estates, and they have areas that would be called karpef, but they're not vegetable gardens, which are not used for habitation. They're flowers and grasses, that's not a karpef. Again, because of the chiluk Rashi says, trees are compatible with dira, vegetables are not, flowers are more like trees, basically. Other posts can go with this far also. Other various Achronim accept this. Other Achronim say no. Divrei Chaim, the Sanzerov, notably disagrees. Says no, Chazal did not make chilukim. All zraim, all planted vegetables, grass-like things are aser. Trees are mutter. We don't start making distinctions. Other great Achronim disagreed, but some Achronim were mekil, some Achronim were machmer. Another debate is, Pri Megadim raises the question, the Gemara talks about where it was enclosed and then it became planted with vegetables. What if the order was reversed? First it was planted and then you made the Eruv, which is the case in many of our Eruvin. That's what happens. You have a city, it has parks, it has marshlands and wetlands and conservation areas, then you make an Eruv around the whole thing. Primogadim is Mesupik. Maybe you'll say in that case, the fact that you specifically made a fence and you made it Hukaf Ladira, maybe that overrides the Zram. He's not sure. He says, Mistaver, that it is Asr. Other poskim, though, are more lenient. The Divra Malkiel argues for the lenient view that in a case where it already was a Gina, and then you consciously and deliberately put a fence around it, L'Shem Dira, around the whole city, including it, L'Shem Dira, maybe that's okay. We have almost the reverse svara appears in the Mrei Yosher. He says, maybe the Gemara is only talking about even where you planted it deliberately, where you planted it consciously, deliberately, after the fences were there. Then we say, Zraim or Mavatel the Mechitzas. The Zraim you planted, they override the Mechitzas. But if they just grew by themselves without anybody intentionally planting them there, maybe they're not Mavatel the Mechitzas. So these are some of the various leniencies we have for Karpeh, for parks and gardens. Moshe Feinstein in general said that parks, he went like the lenient view that parks which are for recreation are anyway not Mavatel the Dira because they're considered compatible with Dira. Other posts can have another major leniency, the Dvar Shmuel, that inside the Eruv of a city, we don't have this rule of Karpeh. If this rule is only in an area that's enclosed, it's not really a whole city. This is a major leniency that when we're dealing with municipal Eruvin, we never have to worry about these types of Karpeh. Some say that's only if the city is walled. Some say even if the city just has a fence around it. This is a major leniency discussed by the Akronim, but many Akronim are not willing to be lenient. But again, we often have Terufim and Karpeh. These are some of the various leniencies poskim invoke when it comes to dealing with Karpeh. On Daf Chof Daled, the Gemara talks about another type of Karpeh situation, water. You had a Karpeh, it was hukaf for Dira, so it was fine. Then some of it became flooded. Now there's water over there. So water also is not so compatible with Dira. Does water invalidate the Eruv? So the Gemara says, Sav Rabbanan L'meimar, they're like Zraim. The Gemara says, no, they're not like Zraim. Why? They're like Mitaim, they're like trees. Why? Meimar says, the Chazian L'tashmishta. We're talking about water which is suitable for human use. What kind of use? Rashi says for drinking. Shulchan Aruch paskins for drinking. If you have potable water, that's compatible with habitation. The implication is, if it's only compatible with other types of usage, then it would not be considered suitable for Dira. The other poskim, though, Mishbur brings the Rashba. The Rashba says that if it is suitable for other types of human use, examples he gives is laundry or other uses, then it is mutter. Shartzina has a long discussion. He concludes, Yesh lahakal ka Rashba. You can be lenient like the Rashba, even if it's not drinking water, even if it's just suitable for other uses. The whole Karpeh, as we kept mentioning, is only an issue of an Isser D'Rabbanan. You can be lenient and follow the Rashba. Mishnah Berurah also points out that the pashtus of the poskim is that mayim, water, when it is a problem, is like zraim, and once it hits the sosayim mark, it invalidates the whole eruv. However, he brings from the Achronim that in some cases water will not be a problem, because one of the key ways to resolve a karpeh, the Gemara has all kinds of other ways. Building extra fences to mevatel the karpeh and make it hukaf l'dira, but one way we're often mevatel a karpeh, we do the opposite. We fence it off from the rest of the eruv. The karpeh remains a karpeh, it's not hukaf l'dira, but by cordoning it off from the rest of the eruv, we say the karpeh is still asu, you can't carry in there, but the rest of the eruv doesn't become tainted by the karpeh because the karpeh is walled off from the rest of the eruv. So the Mishnah Berurah says, in many cases of water, if the water, let's say, is in a pit, or if it's a river, and the banks are steep, we mentioned earlier, the river banks themselves, if they're steep enough, if they're mislakate, if they go up 10 tvachim in elevation within 4 amos of horizontal distance, then that's a mechitza, and that mechitza cordons off the water and will cause the water not to be a problem for the rest of the eruv. Mishnah Berurah brings this and says that halacha is willing to accept this. However, he also brings a chumrah. The Shulchan Aruch says, based on the reading of the Gemara of some Rishonim, the Gemara talks about when is the water a problem. If it's Beis Sasayim, the Gemara's language is, if it's Beis Sasayim, ba'omek. The omek is Beis Sasayim. So some Rishonim learn that means there's an area of Beis Sasayim in area, and that entire area is 10 tfachim tall. 10 tfachim is what makes the water incompatible with dira, unless it's drinkable, and if it's Beis Sasayim, then it's a problem. The Gemara had an opinion initially that Beis Sasayim is a problem. We pass it's not a problem because it's, as long as it's suitable for drinking, then even larger than Beis Sasayim is fine because it's not like Suram. However, even when it is a problem, the Gemara indicates it's only when it's ba'amkan, which some Rishonim understand means it's only when it's 10 tfachim deep. So even when the water is not suitable for human habitation, the Shulchan Aruch paskins that water is only a problem even when it's not Roy L'Shtia, not right for anything even when it's not suitable water, it's only a problem if it is 10 tfachim deep. However, the Biur Halacha brings, that's the opinion of some Rishonim, but he says many other Rishonim disagree. Many other Rishonim say that even though normally to be a separate Rishus, you have to be 10 tfachim deep, here he says the problem is that here he says the problem is that that even less than 10 tefachim, which still is a problem, it still would be a problem of karpef. And the Biur Halacha says, Roy lahachmer shelo b'makom adchak. Even a relatively shallow puddle of water, less than 10 tefachim, would still be shelo b'makom adchak. You should still be machmer. However, less than 3 tefachim, he says, a really shallow puddle, that he thinks is okay l'kuliyam. Going back to the previous point for a moment, we mentioned that Biur Halacha is willing to assume that if the riverbank has walls, the walls are steep, those would be good walls. He does bring one dissenting opinion, brings a Ritva who disagrees. He says Tzarachi and Lamaisa. The Achronim, though, the Magen Avraham brings, says that if the walls are steep, they're always considered good walls. They would cordon off the karpef. The Ritva is Machmer. Why is Ritva Machmer? He says the Ritva must hold when you have a steep hill, that's a wall. When a steep hill is underwater, that's not considered a mechitza because you can't really see the steepness of the wall. Even though a straight wall underwater, it's clear, would be considered a wall. Underwater, we have a stricter standard. To be a wall, it's not enough that it's steep enough to be a wall on dry land. It has to be a completely vertical wall. Tzarachi and Lamaisa. So the Mishmur Lamaisa is not sure about that either. So both these questions, he brings some room for chumrah. Even if there is, some poskim I think do rely on river banks. That if the river banks themselves are steep, certainly under the water, if they're steep even under the water, we don't worry about the karpef. Mishmur says Tzarachi and Lamaisa. If the river banks even above the water, if the banks continue to slope and those banks are steep, that would be good l'kuliyama. But if the steepness of the river bank is submerged in the water, that the Shulchan Aruch seems to be lenient, the Magen Avraham seems to be lenient, but the Mishabur says Tzarachi and Lamaisa. The second question, if the water is not that deep, you can have a shallow stream, it's a couple of tfachim deep. Less than 3 tfachim, the Mishabur says is fine. More than 10 tfachim is a problem if the water is not suitable. Between 3 and 10 tfachim, the Shulchan Aruch is mekel, but the Mishabur says you should be machmer. Shelo b'makom adchak. The book, The Laws of an Eruv, brings from Rav Moshe that today, even if it's less than 10 tefachim, it would be a problem. Why does the Gemara say water is okay because water is suitable for drinking or for laundry? We don't, but today he says, but again, we paskin that if the water is suitable for drinking, then even if it's more than 10 tefachim, I said it wrong before, if it's more than 10 tefachim, if it's suitable for drinking, even if it's more than 10 tefachim, it's fine. If it's not suitable for drinking, if it's less than 10 tefachim, according to the Shulchan Aruch at least, it's still okay because it doesn't really interfere with people. Even if you can't do anything with the water, if it's a shallow thing, it doesn't interfere with dira. Rav Moshe, they say, disagrees. Rav Moshe said today we have higher standards, we're fussier, we don't walk through water even if it's shallow water, puddles that are 6 tefachim deep, we wouldn't walk through such a puddle. So that water would still be a karpef. Mishmur anyway said you should be machmer for the shita of the Rishonim that more than 3 tefachim is a problem. Rav Moshe was machmer too for this other reason that Bizman Hazeh everyone would agree that even less than 10 tefachim is a problem. If the water is suitable for drinking, then it would be fine. However, they say that's also a debate. I'm not sure if that's Rav Moshe or their own svara because today we don't drink stream water. We usually don't. Some stream water is considered unhealthy to drink. We generally don't drink untreated water that we find lying around. So today we have again more exacting standards. So it's today these halachas might be more stringent than they used to be. On Daf Chaf Hey, the Gemara talks more about karpef, all types of different ways of tikkunim, making new fences, and so on. At one point, the Gemara talks about an interesting case. It talks about a case if you have a karpef which is too large, but part of the karpef has a roof. Now, if we say pi tikra yared v'sosem, that there's an imaginary wall descending from the edge of the roof, that would sequester the karpef into 2 separate parts. Each one would be less than beis osayim or less, and that would be fine. Incidentally, that's one of the methods poskim recommend for fixing a karpef. Even if you can't put a wall all around it, if you can bisect it and trisect it and make separations through it, it can still be the same large karpef, but in halacha, each piece is now viewed separately. If you have walls or certain types of separations between them, divide and conquer. Each piece is less than beis osayim, you'll be fine. So that's what happens according to that's what happens in this case. Machlokes Rav and Reb Zera. One of them says that since P tikra yard v'sosem, the principle that an imaginary wall drops down, now we have two separate sections and each one is less than Beis Hasayim. Other one says we don't say that. The Gemara brings machlokas Rav and Shmuel. Achsadra, you have a kind of porch, a structure that doesn't have a full four walls. And the question is, can you carry under that structure? So Rav says yes. Rav says P tikra yard v'sosem. The edges of the roof, we drop down imaginary walls. And now it's like we have the walls so we can carry inside it. Shmuel says, no, we can't carry. Rav says, P tikra yard v'sosem. Shmuel says, we don't say P tikra yard v'sosem. Then the Gemara says, one important distinction, you only say P tikra yard v'sosem on a flat roof, but if the roof is at an angle, if it's ki or zila, at an angle, the post can say, Halachos, such a roof, like many of our roofs, that you don't say P tikra yard v'sosem if the roof is at an angle. If the bottom of the roof is flat and then there's an angle, it could be you do in other cases, but in a roof that simply goes straight at an angle, you don't say P tikra yard v'sosem. How do we pass from P tikra yard v'sosem? When it comes to karpeh, the ikar halacha of our sugya, we paskin that we do say P tikra yard v'sosem lahakel. If you have the three sasayim and the tikra divides it into two, P tikra, we do say P tikra yard v'sosem, and we say that even if it is at a slant, even if it's ki or zila, we still say P tikra yard v'sosem. When it comes to making standard mechitzas, to make an eruv, to enclose an area, there we also pass in P tikra yard v'sosem, but there's a requirement that it not be meshupa, that it not be at an angle. Apparent contradiction. Mishnah Berurah explains, B'Shem the Achronim, that karpef is only a chumrah to begin with. Karpef is it's a din d'Rabbanan, but it's minat Torah. There's no question of needing mechitza at all midaraisa. The whole thing is nisa d'Rabbanan. Rabbanan were lenient to allow P tikra even in a case where it's at an angle. However, in the case where we're dealing with making mechitzas to enclose an area that really needs mechitzas, in such a case we require a more rigorous standard of mechitzas, and we only say P tikra if the roof is flat. The ikar sugya P tikra is later in Eruvin. The Gemara brings a discussion about what Rav and Shmuel were talking about. The halacha is we paskin like Rav, b'yisurim, we paskin lahakel P tikra yard v'sosem. However, there's machlokes rishonim. How many mechitzos do you have to have before you say P tikra yard v'sosem? Rashi, some Rishonim seem to explain there are no mechitzos, and Rav anyway says P tikra yard v'sosem. But other Rishonim learn, and that's how we paskin, you have to have several existing mechitzos on some of the sides before you can use P tikra on the last side. Some say you need 3 mechitzos before you say P tikra on the last side. Some say 2 mechitzos is enough, at least if they're in an L shape, perpendicular to each other, you say P tikra on the other sides. But we paskin, at least if you have some walls, 2 or 3 walls, then you say P tikra, both with regard to the halacha of karpef, to divide the karpef and make each part smaller, as well as with regard to making mechitzas, to be able to carry inside the walls of the karpef. Moshe Feinstein had a famous tshuva in 1952. There have been many discussions over the last century or two of making Eruvin in New York, in Manhattan, in Brooklyn, many different suggestions for how to get walls around these cities. So somebody had proposed in the 1950s that we can use the elevated trains that run along the edges of Manhattan, toward the edges of Manhattan, we can use them as mechitzas. Why are they mechitzas? They're just elevated roads supported by pillars. So some poskim wanted to use it as tzuras of Pesach. They actually wanted to argue that the supports can be the vertical lechis and the road can be a horizontal, the lechi on top. That was one discussion, whether that can be tzuras of Pesach. But Ramosha deals with the suggestion that maybe the road can be P tikra yard v'sosem, as long as there are walls on the right and the left side, on the front, on each of the two sides of the road, we say P tikra. The road itself is like a roof, and it's yard v'sosem, and it creates walls like that. And those walls can be walls all along the highway, which can serve as a wall around one or more sides of Manhattan. So Ramosha himself did not agree. Ramosha advanced numerous arguments why he thought P tikra yard v'sosem would not apply. Again, the details are complicated, but there was at least one Rav who wanted to argue that the elevated trains and the elevated the tracks themselves could serve as walls based on P tikra yard v'sosem. Ramosha, for a variety of reasons, did not accept that line of argument.